Hello and welcome to the Russia Question. I'm your host, Michael Ossorgin, and director of the Russian program at Fordham University Lincoln Center. This webinar is one of the many initiatives of Fordham's Orthodox Christian Studies Center, which facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world broadly understood. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit the website at fordham.edu/orthodoxy. We encourage you to follow us on YouTube and share this and other videos with anyone who might benefit from them. Today we're fortunate to be joined by Amanda Bellows, who is a historian of the United States in comparative and transnational perspective. She is a lecturer at the New School and Hunter College. She received her PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is also the author of American Slavery and Russian Serfdom in the Post-Emancipation Imagination, published by University of North Carolina Press in 2020. Dr. Bellows has conducted archival fieldwork in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Her writing has appeared in academic journals as well as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Talking Points Memo, and Public Seminar. She shared her research with public audiences via C-SPAN, Gilder Lehrman's book breaks, and other programs. So welcome to the Russia Question, Amanda. I think I'd like to start with a question about your comparative work. So recently, a colleague of mine in Slavic studies, Jennifer Wilson, said something I found very interesting in her visit to my Dostoevsky and Race course, Dostoevsky and Race in America course, which is where we feature your book, and that's an interesting conversation to have on its own. The gist of her comment was that she was glad that we were having a comparative course, and she remarked, after all, we live comparatively. So this seems like a very good response to those who might argue that histories as different as Russian serfdom and American slavery are almost too different to compare, right? But it does challenge the illusion that we sort of can't stand outside of time and look at something in the past from that perspective. We're always comparing it to the moment that we live in, right? So what would you say to such a critique that they're too different to compare? And can you speak to the challenges and advantages inherent in your comparative study?
Absolutely. Well, first I wanted to say I'm a big fan of Jennifer's work, and also I would love to take your class sometime because it sounds amazing. But yes, so I have definitely encountered that viewpoint before, that the criticism about comparative history, why do it? Are the two things that you're comparing too different to compare? But I think I agree with Jennifer that we do live comparatively. So I would say that to successfully do comparative history, you have to choose two events or phenomena with something really fundamental in common. So in the case of my book, of course, that is American slavery and serfdom. And the fundamental similarity being that you have a system of forced labor on which the economy in both countries is based. And I think, so first you identify the essential similarities, and then after you've done that and you have a good foundation, that's when you can go and look at these essential differences. So for example, well, thinking about slavery and serfdom, right? They both began in the mid 17th century. They're both abolished just a couple of years apart in the early 1860s. And so some of the research questions that drove my comparison were, how did serfdom and slavery end? Did they end in similar ways or different ways? How did people respond to abolition? And I found that they both responded through cultural production of different kinds. And then you can look at that and say what was similar and what was different within that production of images and literature. And then finally, how do people remember and represent the institutions of slavery and serfdom over that same period of time? So that, I think, hopefully just gives an example of how I think about applying the comparative methodology to a case like slavery and serfdom.
That's great. And on that note, how differently serfdom and slavery ended. I know that, for instance, Peter Kolchin has argued that one took a civil war and another one didn't, and why, right? But I wonder if you agree with that, because in a way, it just seems like the Civil War was delayed in the abolition of serfdom. What do you think?
I was going to say the exact same thing about the delay. I mean, I think things obviously really come to a head in Russia in the early 20th century, and that a lot of those class tensions and unresolved problems that proceeded from the way that serfdom ended do contribute to the revolution occurring, and the bloodshed and societal transformation that Russia experiences, but that America experiences in a different way half a century earlier.
Right. You write about that critical moment of the half century anniversary of the abolition of slavery, serfdom, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And you point out how it's a kind of opportune moment for a revisionist history of what the emancipation was, right? And what its shortcomings were, and was Alexander II really the Tsar liberator, mm-hmm. or were these conditions inadequate to address what they had hoped to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so President Lincoln is seen as the great emancipator, the Tsar liberator, Alexander II. I don't, if everyone knows this already, I apologize, but both men were assassinated and kind of turned into martyr figures, statues, and lots of image production, even around those individuals. So can you remind me where we were going with the question again?
Yeah, just that it was an occasion. Yeah, it was an occasion to rewrite history because it was critical of the emancipation, right? And what it was able to accomplish.
I mean, it's interesting because there's actually like a diversity of opinion on those 50th anniversaries about, was it a success? Was it not a success? And so different people in the societies have different viewpoints. In the United States, African Americans living in the Jim Crow era, where we have legalized segregation, lynching rates at their highest in the 1890s and the turn of the 20th century, right? They see very clearly like the failings of the aftermath of slavery's abolition. And in Russia, you have, I think I wrote about this in the epilogue as well, someone like Lenin who says, this was an unfinished revolution, the abolition of serfdom, and we need a full revolution to fully transform Russian society. Whereas you have other kind of more moderate Russians in, periodicals and things writing about how the reforms have been successful and Russia's become more modern and people do have more opportunities. So again, it's maybe not unexpected, but different viewpoints in both societies.
Sure. And speaking of Kolchin's work, his study of unfree labor sort of gets more into the historical context of the differences and similarities between Russian serfdom and American slavery. Mm-hmm. And you sort of see yourself in dialogue with that work, if I understand it correctly. Can you just tell us about your relationship to his unfree labor and how your book is in dialogue with it, and then the others? It seems like for a starting point, maybe you're kind of interested in the atmosphere that surrounds the artistic atmosphere that surrounds the historical context and eliminates them. Does that seem fair?
Definitely. So I am a huge fan of Peter Kolchin and his work. I first read his book when I was an undergraduate at Middlebury College. And that's where the origins of the book actually came from. So way back at 2008. But Peter eventually became an outside reader on my dissertation committee. So it was great to have his perspective when I was writing this book. I mean, I think his book is really incredible because he does a great job providing, the historical context separately. He's mastered both the histories of both countries. But then also really successfully applies that comparative methodology in identifying some of those critical similarities and differences, such as the kind of status of enslaved people as outsiders, permanent outsiders in American culture. And that's something that I think is going to influence their representation in the aftermath. Whereas in Russia, right, you have the peasants who say, we are yours, but the land is ours. They were born there. Their ancestors are buried there. They share the same language and religion. And then you have the racial difference as a central component in the United States. So I think culture does a great job at identifying some of those similarities and differences that then help us better understand the aftermath and how people remember slavery and serfdom.
We also feature his book in our class, and I'm a fan. And between his and your work, I think it's as perfect an introduction as one can expect in a short period of time to such a complex topic. So thank you for that.
Oh, I'm so delighted that you're enjoying the books. I was going to say that Peter he's been working on sort of the sequel, a really solid comparison of abolition in both countries. And I know that book is hopefully going to be coming out soon. So
exciting. That is exciting. I'm happy to hear that. So you mentioned one of the kind of key differences being the relationship between serfs and religion versus enslaved people in America and Christianity, right? I guess in a way it would sort of be hard to do an artistic comparative study of that because of like the Calvinist tradition that's against the religious images in the church, right? That's sort of anti-iconic. But I suppose that there are inherent kind of problems in representation in the Russian tradition. Did it cross your mind to do a kind of religious art comparative study in yours?
That's a great question. And this is not something that appears in the book, but I have done a little bit of research on the topic of religious participation. And actually and I'm not an expert on this at all, but my initial findings suggest that the ways in which enslaved people and serfs participated or didn't participate in their respective religious traditions influenced the ways in which they understood their condition of servitude. So in the Protestant church, it's very democratic and participatory, whereas I believe Russian Orthodox services are a little more hierarchical. And then music is a central part, of course, of both traditions. The Russian Orthodox Church has an amazing, musical tradition. And African Americans produced a genre of music called spirituals. And so these spirituals were all about salvation, but both heavenly salvation and also earthly salvation. And so some of these songs were encoded with secret meaning about escaping to freedom. And so I think that, I'd love to hear your opinion too about this idea, but I just have the sense that enslaved African Americans, right, they got to kind of express themselves and even express ideas about wanting to be free. And I'm not sure that is happening in the Russian context in church settings. Well,
this is something that I think my students will by now at the end of the semester be familiar with, some of them, that is. This is the sort of thing that is exactly at the heart of my comparative study in Dostoevsky and race in America, right? Because my whole question is, well, how is it that, three writers in particular, Baldwin, Wright, and Ellison, were so taken by Dostoevsky's work, this sort of white, kind of low-level aristocratic, old Russian writing about psychology. What would that have to do with Jim Crow America, right? And a tentative answer that we have come up with for it is that basically there's a kind of enmeshment of literal and figurative enslavement, and Dostoevsky sort of understands the psychology of imprisonment and isolation in such a way that resonates with Ellison, for instance, or Baldwin, or write, all of who variously said that they felt when they were reading Dostoevsky, they were reading their own autobiographies, right? So it's in more ways an interesting and kind of strange, but very convincing overlap between these two cultures. It appears in literature of Dostoevsky. You also write about literature in your work. Can you sort of tell us about that chapter?
Sure. So there are a couple chapters that touch on literature, but my favorite chapter, I think, that deals with literature is the second chapter, which I think had a really intriguing finding. So in U.S. historians are very familiar with this kind of body of nostalgic literature that comes out of the American South, where you have plantation literature, it can be called, where you have representations of freed people as being, really wanting to be back in slavery and writing about how it really wasn't so bad and that kind of thing. And I think people generally thought of that as being unique to the American context, and perhaps largely influenced by some of those race differences between the white planters and the enslaved people. But what I found in the Russian case is there was actually a wide body of fiction, not elevated literature like that of Dostoevsky, right? But kind of like mass-oriented literature where you have these serfs who are now peasants and writing, speaking nostalgically in these stories about how life was better under serfdom and how the conditions weren't that bad, and some really striking similarities between the types of stories. And yet most of these works had never been translated into English, but statistics showed that they were some of the most popular works that were checked out of libraries, for instance, in the late 19th century. So I think it's an under-researched area. What hold on the imagination did these nostalgic stories about serfdom have on particular groups of Russians?
And that's interesting that it's coming from like the formerly inserted, let's call them peoples, whereas Dostoevsky is approaching it sort of from without, right? And Du Bois is similar in that way, where he's kind of, on the one hand, externally similar and definitely bears a powerful relationship to what African-American culture, but he really is kind of looking at it from the outside. So having the perspective of artistic representation from the serfs becomes especially important, and makes sense why that would be more popular among serfs who would sort of feel understood, right?
Right. So in some of the periodicals that are targeting, newly literate peasants at the turn of the 20th century into the 1900s and 1910s, that's where you start to see stories about really talking more about the experience of liberated peasants in a more realistic way and not a nostalgic way. And so that's where you can find some of those types of works.
Great. And I'm wondering if we could have a look, just to get a feel for the type of comparative study that's in your book, at a couple of paintings, and we could sort of go through your thought process and analysis.
Sure, let me just pull those up.
And while she's doing that, I want to remind everyone that while we're chatting, please feel free to put your questions in the chat so that at the end of our kind of conversation and presentation, we could turn to those questions and I'll field them. So just pop those in the chat and we'll.
So before I pull up the images, one of them is by the Russian painter Nikolai Nevrev, and it's called Bargaining, a Scene from Serf Life from the Recent Past. And it was painted in 1866, so 5 years after the abolition of serfdom. And we'll be contrasting that image with a painting by a man named Thomas Satterwhite Noble, and it's called The Price of Blood, and it's from 1868. So let's do the Nevrev one first, which is, here we go. Can you all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So here we are in the interior of the estate owner's home. here he is in his slippers, dressing gown, looks like he's smoking a pipe or something here. And so it's a scene of bargaining. So what he's doing is bargaining over the price of this woman here. And you can see the other peasants are watching intently to see what her fate will be. I think that the material wealth of the landowner is evident. The beautiful painting and prints on the walls. He is literate. He has his books here. And he's a man of leisure, right? He looks comfortable and relaxed and happy in his home. But I think, you might ask yourself as the viewer, to what extent does this image criticize serfdom? And of course, Russia had censors at this time, and artists and authors had to carefully address the topic of serfdom, even in its aftermath. But I would argue that this is a very subtly critical image of landowners like this man here and of the institution of serfdom, because the title is about bargaining, and it's not explicitly mentioning a human life, but you can see the woman represented here. You can see the way that the men are sort of trying to deny her humanity, I would argue, by looking away, where she's directly confronting them in this situation. And she even, I think, has this sort of posture of defiance with her crossed arms, which you could interpret, right, as a subtle way of, right, resisting, trying to resist that situation. Should I flip to the next one?
Yeah, it's very, I wanted to sort of, I was wondering about this larger painting in the back, just because it seems like it's possibly a neoclassical depiction. I don't know how you would characterize it, but it just reminded me of the way that the aristocracy would have itself depicted, namely kind of in an elevated state in comparison to gods and goddesses in the mythical tradition. Whereas this, like you're saying, is a critical look in the sense of being a form of realism that's willing to look at the social dynamics underlying that kind of celebrated self-aggrandizement.
Mm-hmm. And I guess one more thing to add, I teach a course at the New School about global slaveries, and we start in ancient Greece and go all the way to the present. And what you see in representations of enslaved or usurped people across space and time is that there are always attempts to kind of dehumanize them. And oftentimes that means depicting them nude, or wearing minimal clothing, kind of subjugated postures. And this woman here and the other serfs, right, look very human and I would say elegant. And you can see their rich cultural traditions, right, on display in their clothing. So I think that's another sign that the artist does not view usurped people, right, as inferior.
It reminds me of one of the most powerful images that you have in this chapter, which is when a former enslaver is visiting the home of a recently freed person's, and just that event in itself, looking at the actual dynamic, what would that be like? Well, here you are, with your kind of former master.
The Winslow Homer painting.
The Winslow Homer, yes, thank you. And just the thought of that scenario is kind of mind-boggling alone, but the way in which it's depicted is also very socially critical of the newfound freedom and the wrongness, the backwardness of it before the emancipation. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So for viewers, that is a painting by Winslow Homer that we're talking about called A Visit from the Old Mistress. I believe it's from about 1876. And it shows the wife probably of the enslaver, and she is probably in the slave quarters, but the freed people are depicted in a way that shows their agency and resistance to the situation in the aftermath of abolition. So it's worth checking out.
Pain and resentment.
Oh yes,
yeah,
it's a very tense loaded moment. So if you'd like to see the other painting by Thomas Satterwhite Noble, I could share that one now.
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is called The Price of Blood, and it was painted just 2 years after Noble's, after Nevreb's painting. And I don't know whether Thomas Satterwhite Noble had ever seen the Russian painting, but the similarities are really striking. So you can see the slaveholder here, and he, like the other gentleman, is depicted in his, jacket for lounging inside, his slippers, dressing gown, I guess. And you can also see a little bit, some glimpses of his material wealth, right? In the glasses, in the rich fabric on the tablecloth, this antique looking chair. And here is the person, and he's going to be trading this man. And you can see that the color of his skin is sort of light brown. And I think that, plus the title of the painting, The Price of Blood, is supposed to suggest to the viewer that this man is actually the son of this man, who would have, raped one of his enslaved, one of the women that he enslaved. And so I guess you could ask yourself again, as a viewer, right, what's the artist's perspective of slavery in this scenario? And I would argue that because, again, they're not looking at each other. The title, The Price of Blood, this man is selling his own son into slavery. What a horrific thing to do. I think it's a condemnation of everything that has happened that has led up to this terrible, terrible moment.
That reminds me of the sort of undercurrent of when it finally became illegal to import enslaved persons, right? But the sort of homegrown horrific solution to that was to have citizenship be determined by who your mother was, right? Or sorry, not citizenship, ethnicity be determined by who your mother was. So white enslavers would then rape Black women, and their children would be considered Black in the eyes of the law because their mother was, right? And
there was something called the one drop rule. And so if they had any African descent at all, they were considered to be Black in the eyes of the law as well.
Right. And so that sort of solution of breeding new American enslaved persons is just one of the kind of eerie undercurrents behind this painting.
Just a data point, it's in the number of people who were enslaved in Africa and reached British North America in the slave trade is in the hundreds of thousands. And yet by the beginning of the Civil War, there are 4 million enslaved people in the United States. So much of that, not all, but much of it is due to, population growth. And some of that is from this situation we've just described.
So one of the unless, let's see, did you have anything else to say about the painting? Thank you for that. That I think is just those images alone are sort of indicative of the natural conversation in place between the histories of either culture, right? And you had mentioned some of the differences and similarities earlier of serfdom and slavery, but I wondered if we could just sort of establish, as you see them, the ground rules for what's common. I know that, you mentioned the scarcity of agricultural labor, right? And relative to the amount of land, and culture talks about the restriction of movement at another point that's common to both being, as you mentioned also in your book, they're on the periphery of the European empire, which I think is an interesting kind of point in common. Could you just say for us kind of how you view those general differences and similarities?
Sure. So serfdom as a system, right, is a little different from slavery in that serfs in Russia are bound to the land on which they work. That is what happened over time, right? The law code is passed in 1649, and that perpetually bound Russia's peasant population to the land upon which they worked. And then the serfs paid their owners rent, and then they could work in a variety of fields, such as industries such as agriculture, mining, or manufacturing. And then the contrasting way in which slavery begins in the United States, only about 30 years earlier, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown as part of that transatlantic slave trade between 1526 and 1867. About 12 million Africans were captured and forced to cross the Atlantic Ocean on slave ships. Only 10 million survived that journey that was called the Middle Passage. Unlike serfs, enslaved African Americans did not pay rent to their owners, and they had far less personal autonomy. They weren't tied to the land, and they were more frequently sold and separated from their families and communities. So those are some of the differences between how serfdom and slavery began.
Right. It's interesting too, you mentioned in your book how one of the sort of conditions that you could say naturally reinforced the difficulty of escaping was that, there were two of them, right? One of them was that the enslaved African American people were brought to the United States. In other words, thereby divorcing them from their community entirely, where they say there was a lot harder time subjugating native workers because they could flee to their communities which were nearby, right? What was left of them, unfortunately. But the problem of, kind of higher concentration of melanin ends up being making it harder for enslaved peoples to flee, right? Because they're visibly dissimilar from the
it's hard to
predominant
pass.
demographic.
If you do escape in the South, it's hard to pass.
Right.
But there is, I think, what's interesting is there is an awareness among enslaved people in the United States of places where you can escape and be legally free. That boundary between the free North and the South. Also, Canada is viewed as a land of freedom as well. Whereas serfdom is legal, I think, throughout most of Russia, right? And maybe it's not so enforced in the borderlands, but the borderlands are really far away and, hard to get to. So I think if you look at narratives written by enslaved people and written by enserfed peasants as well, you'll see different perceptions of themselves. John McKay, maybe you've read his 4 Russian serf narratives that he translated. Maybe you've read some in Russian.
Not yet, no, but I will now.
Highly recommend. They're great and great for a classroom exercise too. But there's a long poem that this one serf named Peter O. He's trying to send it to the Tsar, actually, and it's all about the experience of serfdom. And in that, he writes really about the fatalism that the serfs feel about their situation. They don't have a sense that there's much possibility beyond the lives that they're living. There's bitterness and resentment, but there's less of a kind of an idea of hope and escape. And I found that same trend, that same theme in the songs that I talked about before. So I've done a study of different Russian folk songs and things. And again, you really have very, very few examples of ideas about liberty and escape from slavery, whereas in the American context, African-American songs are full of songs about getting away.
Right. Yeah. Right. And then there's the problem of getting away, like that is the relocation to the North, right? And the kind of new outward appearance of old forms of oppression that exist there, right? I mean, that's what Native Son is about in so many ways. And it reminds me of your chapter on advertisements and ephemera, because I mean, that has a direct influence on biggers in Native Son's perception of himself and of what's expected of him, and how he ought to behave, almost by being framed as a criminal. He ought to be a criminal, otherwise it would challenge an existing narrative that the status quo is comfortable with, right? But I feel like that kind of level of immersion in a hegemonic viewpoint is important, especially for serfs who were largely illiterate, right? So just seeing images of themselves depicted patronizingly has to have, over time, an influence on the way that they perceive themselves. Can you tell us about that chapter?
Absolutely. I mean, so that chapter also was really has some intriguing findings, I think, and it was really just so interesting to be able to look at, I loved looking at the advertisements in Russia and in the National Library, and so many things that still exist from that period. So I think you definitely, but what's similar, you've got two countries that are going through industrialization and modernization, and companies are hiring people or doing in-house, they're constructing advertisements, visual images to sell these new mass-oriented products. You also have two countries in which the populations of people who've been in serfdom or enslaved are becoming increasingly literate and also perhaps getting a little more money, so maybe they can be consumers, especially in the Russian context. And then you have urban migration as well, and that's a place where you can have access to more goods and and more freedom on an individual level, et cetera. So those are some of the things that are happening in both countries. But I think that's one of the most, so what's similar and what's different? So what's similar is you still have advertisements targeting, in the US, targeting white middle-class consumers, whether they were in the South or not, it didn't matter, but you have nostalgic representations of slavery, demeaning and racist representations of African Americans being used to sell products to those white consumers. In the Russian context, you do also find nostalgic representations of serfdom, peasants depicted as, children, sort of these infantilizing representations. However, African Americans made up about 12% of the US population at the turn of the 20th century, whereas peasants in Russia made up, closer to 80% at the turn of the 20th century. So peasants are like a larger group and potentially have more buying power. And so you actually start to see these egalitarian images of Russian peasants, and you don't see egalitarian images of African Americans. And so you have to ask yourself, why are these images coming out of this, area in Russia and not in the United States? And I think it has to do with the businesses recognizing that peasants are a formidable potential consumer group. And so let's make ads that show them as savvy urban dwellers, literate, discerning customers. So there's a range of cool representations showing peasants in those scrolls.
So it's a kind of economic flattery, right?
I think so.
Yeah, like a conditioning of your, target audience, right? Or target consumer, more specifically, right?
And maybe it's is it a surprise? I don't know that it's not out of the, we don't see people in this period out of the goodness of their hearts in Russia anyway, like depicting those images. It does come from like the business context, right? There's that capitalism is the goal. They want people to buy the products. And
you could say, that it's important to acknowledge too what Alexander II said, which you also point out, right? That basically, if we don't liberate the serfs from the top down, then they'll liberate themselves, right? And so even that emancipation was not because of the recognition of the dignity of these human beings, right? It was more like, well, look, if we value our lives and we don't want a revolution, then we had better offer, at least nominally or legally, some form of the appearance of freedom, right? And then and the idea of the landowning elite participating in the American context is hard for us to imagine, right? Because we just think, Civil War,
how could the slaveholders have ever participated in crafting the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation? But that is right, exactly what happens in the Russian context. So doing it early before there's a revolution or rebellion gave the elites the chance to write things favorably in their own interest, right?
Right. And that's not to sort of excuse the American reasons for abolishing slavery, which were also certainly economically motivated, right? That is interested in other things besides simply liberating people and treating them as free, complete, individuals who deserved dignity and were irreplaceable.
Right. I mean, even during the war, right, the Emancipation Proclamation is an act of war against the Confederacy, and it only frees people in the Confederacy. But that's the exact area where Lincoln doesn't have full control. He doesn't free enslaved people in the area that he does control, which are the border states. So, I think what it does is it makes abolition now a goal of the war in 1863. And then as the Union Army moves through the South, they liberate people. People come to the Union Army because they're going to protect them. They join the Union Army and fight, hundreds of thousands, almost 200,000 in the war effort. So, but, it's a gradual process. Like you said, it's not just this flash of, humanitarianism in a moment.
One of my students who wrote on your book pointed a very astute student who wrote about how freedom was earned in America differently, especially violently or especially by fighting. And the analysis, one of the paintings that she analyzes is the big celebratory painting in New York. You'll have to give me our audience better context than that if you can, but also the triptych, the contraband, the recruit, and the veteran, right? Which is like, I don't know, I can very crudely show you this one.
Thomas Waterman Wood. That's made in about 1867, so 2 years after the war ends, for those listening.
So the idea there being like this recruit, first of all, the contraband comes in kind of against the South to fight against the South, right? And then the recruit looks sort of proud and distinguished, and then this final, the veteran, almost looks like kind of an extension of the war machinery, right? Like missing a limb, still saluting, still sort of with dignity, but a kind of, I don't know, shell-shocked dignity at the least, right? But the student was quick to point out that this is a way of kind of earning your medal as a free person is through war. Do you agree with that?
I think that's very astute. And I think that when Wood was creating this painting, I imagine, this is a period when there's a lot of tension and hotly debated, right? Intense discussions about what rights free people are going to have. So when slavery ends, that amendment, which is the 13th Amendment, it's ratified in 1865. So the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't actually legally end slavery everywhere. The 13th Amendment's ratification in the year the war ends does. It doesn't give enslaved people, or freed people, citizenship. So it's not until the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868 that formerly enslaved people, and all African Americans actually across the country now have citizenship. And then it isn't until 1870 that people, Black men, gain the right to vote through the ratification of the 15th Amendment. So there's this period of years, right, where people are fighting for their rights, and they want those rights, and they want the rights of citizens. And so I think that when Wood is making that painting, right, he's speaking to people and trying to shape their understanding of, African Americans gave their bodies and their lives to preserve the Union. They're wearing the uniform of the U.S. Army. And yet in 1867, that's a moment right before citizenship is codified in the Constitution for them. And yet they're making these sacrifices. So I think it's like a message to people saying, look at what sacrifices they've made. And yes, I think your student is exactly right. It's a way of saying, African Americans are having to earn their freedom.
Right. And it's another difference, right? Another critical difference is, I mean, definitely there are, you have paintings in there that depict the draft, for instance, the forced draft, right? In Russia.
In the Russian context. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Where they, they also have to fight, but it's not in the same way of earning their citizenship. It's just that they're being marched off to their death, more or less, right? You point out how it's, often the case that the term for military service is longer than the life expectancy of your average servant.
So tragic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's a different kind of sadness, a toska that you see in the Russian paintings, right? Where they're not going to earn anything. They're just fighting someone else's war.
That's a great point. And it continues, right? Even after serfdom ends, the peasants making up a large part of the army. No, I think those are some very, very tragic images. And just one more connection point from earlier, looking back, if you look at some folk songs about military service, the word slavery, if I remember correctly, comes up to talk about being conscripted, and there, you're kind of like a slave of the state. Your life is over. Yeah. Right.
There's that one Rapin who has the sort of image of the young serf being sent off to war, and the entire community is surrounding him, and off in the distance you see this kind of I don't know, afterlife looking distant kingdom, and you have the sense that he's being sent off to his death, right? And they're just mourning that. They're mourning that reality, that there's nothing that they can do. Speaking of forced conscription, yikes, a painful but necessary segue. One of the things that I had mentioned to you before our talk was this kind of the power of representation to shape historical narratives in the Ukraine-Russian conflict, right? Or that's the wrong way to put it. The Russian unlawful and inhumane invasion of Ukraine. And so one of the things that I had read recently from a British journalist pointed out how in the St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev, there's the depiction of a Russian prince historically, right? This is dating back to, this cathedral dates back to the 12th century, I believe. Wow. Who's talking about sort of, look at this prince's face, who's from Russia, and its Mongoloid appearance, right? And there's this kind of sense that I don't know that Russians are depicted as being interbreeding and culturally influenced by by Asia, broadly speaking, right? By Mongols and Turks, and so the Ukrainian nationalist sort of trend is to respond to Russian ethnic nationalism with a Ukrainian ethnic nationalism. And I don't know, this is ongoing, but it seems connected exactly to your comparative study in this way, which is that the kind of way in which we polarize or depict one another ends up having serious political ramifications.
Absolutely. I think that's a really interesting idea that you have brought up, the idea of representations of xenophobic nationalism in this context. And it just reminds me, again, of some of the images I've seen looking at slavery and war across different societies. So I think that people will often construct differences between different groups of people in order to justify violence or to justify exploitation, if you're thinking about the context of slavery. So if just a couple examples, I guess, if we're going to move back to slavery for a second, from the ancient world to the modern world, people have created ideas about physiognomic differences. So they'll say, oh, well, this, these people, they may look like me, or they may speak a different language or have a different religion or not look like me. And that means that they are inherently lazy or less intelligent, in an attempt to justify their enslavement or exploitation. And in wartime too, I was thinking back to World War II, the US government has to mobilize the country, get people to enlist, get people to, to fight against Japan and Germany. And so we see a lot of government produced posters during that war depicting Japanese people and German people as animalistic or barbaric. And it's a way of dehumanizing them so that people will say, okay, well, how am I going to feel comfortable killing, other people, other human beings? So I think it's something that we see throughout history, and it's very sad to see it, it happening still.
Absolutely. Yeah. We do have a question from our audience that we might touch on as we close here. Question is, are former serfs the cannon fodder for Moscow in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, in fighting Ludendorff in World War I, and fighting Germany in 1945, and from Irkutsk in Yakutia today in Ukraine? Different generations, same populace, the question?
I don't know a direct answer to that question without doing a little more research, but I think it's fair to say that in World War II and in many different wars, right, Russians have had very high death tolls in those conflicts, and
it reminds me of the kind of the populace that, or the portion of the population that is conscripted even in today's invasion of Ukraine, right? Which some have to do with former republics, or the kind of certainly a poorer population who is almost a kind of way out of their poverty through conscription, right? So it's a kind of continuation of that, the lowest economic rung on the ladder is used as cannon fodder in that sense, I would say, to this day, right? There's nothing.
Yeah, and that happened. Sorry. I think over time in the US too, right? Oftentimes people who are of lower status or have fewer means aren't able to get their way out of, a draft. I'm thinking of lots of different wars in US history, right? Or they sent, in certain wars, they could even have someone take their place, right? If they had the means to do that. So I think that is common across wars, is that, perhaps vulnerable people are the ones that end up doing the worst fighting.
Well, I wanted to have a sense for what you're working on now, and is it connected to this work that you're doing, that you in the book, or is it a new direction? Just before we leave here, we're almost coming to our close.
Sure, thank you. So I'm working on a couple things, some academic and some directed towards a more mainstream audience. On the academic front, I'm thinking of expanding that topic in the epilogue, writing an article looking more into those 50th anniversary of emancipation in both countries, and looking at it. I didn't get to all the sources that I wanted to study, and so I had to go further.
This book is half sources, however, in the back, so it's not from a lack of trying.
But I also have a book coming out next May with William Morrow, which is an imprint of HarperCollins, and it's about it's more transnational than comparative. It's about different explorers in U.S. history, and there is a nice chapter that looks at the Soviet Union and the U.S. and the space race and different astronauts. So that was a fun project as well.
That sounds great.
Thanks.
Well, if unless you had anything else to add, then we might bring our session to a close.
Can I ask what you're working on next or currently?
Of course, yeah. It's I guess not so obviously related. It's still on Dostoevsky, but what I'm working on is putting Bakhtin's chronotope into a new perspective. So Bakhtin has defined a chronotope as a sort of literary time space of a work of art, right? Or when like we read, for example, a work of literature, we kind of reimagine what it's like for a character to be on a train or versus, you know, in a very small apartment in St. Petersburg, and just kind of how that sets up the meaning-bearing parameters for our study of those things. But his is rooted in chronos, in chronology, from where we get chronology, and in clock time, in empirical time. And I'm adding the kairotope to his theory, which is rooted in the type of time that is called kairos, which is various things in history. In this particular tradition, I think it has to do with a kind of breakthrough to a kind of liturgically conditioned sense of time in Dostoevsky. So it's kind of adding the theology of time and space to the Bakhtinian conversation through the kairotope, with deep reverence for Bakhtin, of course, and great trepidation and trying to do anything we can to improve. I don't know if you had that sense. You said you're a big fan of Kolchin, but what a gift it is to be able to come up against sort of certain limits in those people that we admire, so that because they've taken us there,
right,
and then be able to say more about that, right? We can only hope that, you know, those people who read us will do the same, right?
That would be nice. Your project sounds fantastic. I wish you all the best.
Focus, same to you, and I hope that you'll come back when you've published your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone in the audience for being part of the conversation today. Appreciate it. Yes,
thank you so much to the audience. I just want to have a few closing remarks. Thank you, Amanda Bellows, our attendees who contribute to our discussions, the Orthodox Christian Studies Center co-directors, George Demokopoulos and Aristotle Papanikolaou, for the platform. The Associate Director, Nathaniel Wood, is the Managing Editor of the Studies Center's publication, scholarly research called Public Orthodoxy, and helps to organize this event. And special thanks to collaborators, Fordham's Executive Assistant, Siobhan Verlesa, and Catherine Mandalakis, for helping to organize and promote the event. Just so you know how many people are involved in putting this together, I'm grateful to each of them, and I'm grateful to the smart people who write fascinating books for giving us something to talk about like this. So thank you very much, Amanda, and we hope to see you in the future.
Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.